Welcome to the Above Board podcast, and I am your host, John Kennedy. Last month, Rich and I recorded a podcast, and it was called Risk, Regret, and Resilience. It was episode 126 for those of you who want to go back and have a listen. But in this episode, Rich talked about the importance of experiencing small micro failures, and I thought we'd dedicate some time to what that means, at least for me, expanding on the idea that micro failures are often a result of taking micro risks. And taking those little risks can lead to macro gains later. So what exactly is a micro risk? I like to think of them as these small leaps of faith that we take in our daily lives. They're not huge. It's not like a life-altering gamble, but it's a small calculated step outside of our comfort zone. Maybe it's calling that prospect that you're nervous about. I often have to remind myself that in situations like this, the worst that can happen is usually not that bad. In this example, the person says no, and the upside is typically far greater than any sort of downside. And so I'd like to ask you, the listener, what is that for you today? What's the thing that gives you butterflies in your belly when you think about having to do it because you know it's important to move the needle and you don't want to mess it up? We all face these, and we face them daily. Micro risks are crucial because they help us grow without overwhelming us. Imagine for a moment trying to run a marathon without any type of formal training. You'd get hurt, you'd fail, pretty plain and simple. But by starting with short runs, gradually increasing your distance, you build endurance, you build confidence. And similarly, micro risks help prepare us for bigger challenges by building our resilience and our adaptability. I think it helps me frame life in a little bit of a different way, because as someone who's naturally risk averse, I had to come up with a way to view risk positively so that I would even take risks. Now, I don't mean anything crazy or out of the norm. I'm not talking about gambling or skydiving or like driving without my seatbelt. That's not even risk. It's just like dumb and unsafe. But I think this episode is geared towards the risk averse person to help them understand how risks can benefit them. Actually, scratch that. I also think it's for risk takers too, because this entire topic is about taking calculated risks. And a risk taker by nature has a very hard time understanding what that means. So let's define that for a moment. What's a calculated risk? It's a decision made after a lot of careful consideration on the benefits and the drawbacks. It's an informed decision. We're not gambling. We're not doing anything based on chance. We're taking calculated risks with analysis and with planning to minimize potential downside. So let's talk about some of these micro calculated risks that we can consider. How about, for example, at work? Maybe a micro risk looks like doing things to propel your career forward. For example, volunteering for a new project that might seem kind of stressful, but it could showcase your skills or your work ethic to your boss. And your biggest downside there is maybe extra time spent and it didn't have the desired outcome. Skill enhancement's another big one where I think micro risks pay off. So use my example from earlier that I opened with. You cold call a potential customer and they say no. Learning how to build that thicker skin of maybe, hearing someone be not so kind to you and saying no to you in not the nicest way possible. And then growing from that helps you learn how to navigate tough conversations. Nothing develops your skill in the art of conversation quite like that, I find. Here's another one. Go for that designation or that certification. Bet on yourself. That's what today's conversation is about. It's to implore you to bet on yourself. I'll use this example of how risk averse I am. I spent the first 8 years of my career without my CFP marks. And for those that don't know, that stands for Certified Financial Planner. I wanted to make sure that it was the right call for me, that I loved doing this as a profession and helping people financially. And not only that it was my calling, but that I could do it well enough to get paid, like to earn a living off of doing this. So when I finally decided to sit for the course and then ultimately sit for the exam, this was like a bet on myself moment, because I had all these what ifs, like what if I failed? How was I going to look to my colleagues? What was I going to tell clients who I told them that I was taking the exam if I had failed? What would they think? But it was time, and I studied every day for 2 years for that test, a little bit each and every day. And like investing is such a good example for micro risk and macro gain. In the world of finance, these little risks that we take can make all the difference. Like think about starting with a small investment. We set a little bit aside each month into the markets or some type of diversified portfolio. And over time, these contributions grow and we benefit from this thing called the power of compound interest. Anyone who's listened to this show even remotely knows we've talked about that a bunch. And by the way, along the way, you've learned this discipline and this skill to save and live on a little bit less than you thought you could. And so, since I like to make my points, let's look at the value of micro risks and then long-term rewards for just a moment. Imagine you decided to save $100 a month for the next 30 years, and the average rate of return was 7%. Now, I'm using estimations here that we can't predict returns, of course, but let's say the average rate of return was 7%. At the end of 30 years, you will have contributed 36 grand, but the account would be worth a little over $122,000 due to compound interest. Now, if you waited just 10 years to start that plan, it would only be worth 57,000. That difference is massively significant, and it kind of illustrates the point of starting small and starting early. Is it a risk to invest your money in the markets? Heck, yes, it is. But you can make it a calculated risk by researching what you're investing in or using diversification, and maybe even investing a little bit each month, which is a strategy known as dollar cost averaging. Now, I'm going to try to bring this example home by exploring the story of this little known investor called Warren Buffett. And again, for those who listen to this, know I like talking about Warren Buffett. I think he's the poster child for micro risk and macro gain. He started his investment journey at a very young age. He was like 11 years old. And his approach was not taking large risky bets. It was small, informed decisions consistently over time. So he started with buying 3 shares of a company. And initially that stock price dropped. And he learned the value of patience. And then he watched it eventually rebound, and he sold it for a small profit. And he realized he could have made even more if he held on for longer. So his strategy became what's known as today as value investing. So instead of chasing trends and returns, he focused on companies with really strong fundamentals and then made small, informed investments. For instance, 1964, he invested in Berkshire Hathaway. And I think we all know what that story turned into. And so his story is a testament to being consistent and taking small strategic steps to lead to significant gains later. And I think for me, his journey is it's one of those stories that kind of underscores the importance of like going one step at a time, like building brick by brick and piece by piece, instead of just chasing return or hoping for something big and taking a huge, massive risk and potentially having the downside of that risk versus taking these small micro risks that can lead to macro gains later. So, by the way, I had to learn this for myself. Again, I mentioned that I'm a risk averse person by nature, but I've learned about myself that I actually learn way more from my micro risks and then maybe even my micro failures than I ever have from my successes. So, what is a calculated micro risk that you're going to take this week? Maybe it's starting a new habit. Maybe it's calling that person you're nervous to call or having that conversation you've been avoiding. Perhaps it's taking on a small project at work or even just setting aside money for your future. I'd love for you to share in the comments with us on social or on our YouTube channel what you're doing this week to take a micro risk, and we'll share those on future episodes. We hope this conversation today has inspired you and just really, I think more than anything, inspiring you to keep on doing the hard things in life, because it's doing those challenging and difficult things that can make life easier later. Thank you as always for joining me today on the Above Board podcast, and we'll see you next week.